Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In today's video I have some book recommendations for Gilmore Girls fans. So if you love the show Gilmore Girls, you may want to try these books. I'm going to give you tons of different recs from different genres and tell you why they reminded me of Gilmore Girls, and then you can check them out yourselves. So let's get right into the books. So the first book is Maybe This Time by Kasie West. This one, for me, really reminded me of Gilmore Girls because it is set in a town that I found very reminiscent of Stars Hollow. This is a YA romance that follows a girl who works at the local flower store and a guy who works with the local caterer. And because of that, they end up at a lot of the same events because the caterers are at the same place as the florists. And basically this town has all kinds of events. This is what reminded me a lot of Stars Hollow, was there is like a 4th of July festival and like a fall festival, and like they have all of these different events that these two are constantly ending up at because they're both there to work, and so they're constantly running into each other. Like I said, it's a YA romance. It's really cute. It follows them working and falling for each other over that course of that time. And I just, like I said, the little festivals that they were throwing and the events that the town was having were very reminiscent of all the events that they have in Stars Hollow, and so this one just reminded me a lot of that. Next is The Tourist Attraction by Sarah Morgenthaler, which follows a girl who goes on a trip to Alaska and ends up at this diner called the Tourist Trap that is owned by this super grumpy guy that is not really happy that all the tourists are in his place, but at the same time he needs the money, so he's like kind of, you know, angry about them being there, but he also wants them there. But he reminded me so much of Luke in this book because he is just like the grumpy, outdoorsy, like rugged diner owner who has tons of customers but is kind of like snarky to them. And he just reminded me a lot of Luke and Lorelai in this book, like their sort of dynamic where their girl's like, oh, but you know, you put like a little happy face on that kid's burger, and he's like, so what? And he's just like very like grumpy but like still sweet like underneath it all. And he reminded me a lot, like I said, of Luke Danes, and like if Luke were to own a diner in Alaska, I feel like this would have been that, like that's what this book was. And it just reminded me a lot of him and his sort of interactions with the people that come into Luke's, and just his general demeanor was very similar to the guy in this book. And like I said, it takes place in Alaska, very like outdoorsy, like kind of vibes, which I feel like Luke Danes really has as well. So this reminded me a lot of that. Next was It Happens One Summer by Tessa Bailey. I feel like I honestly can't remember why I thought this book reminded me of Gilmore Girls. I think it was like the small town vibes in this one. The town is very like close-knit. They all kind of know each other and they're all kind of up in each other's business. And this one follows a girl who is pretty rich and ends up getting sent to this small town to sort of like humble herself, I guess. And she goes there with her sister, and she ends up, basically she's there to rejuvenate this bar that her dad once owned. And she shows up and all the locals are kind of like not interested in her being there because she's just like this rich girl that showed up out of nowhere to take over their bar, and they're not a fan of her, and she's just like, I have to be here and do this. And she ends up meeting this really grumpy fisherman. And I really think it was the town that reminded me of Gilmore Girls in this, where like they're all up in each other's business, they all know everything. She's going to like visit these people and they're all like, they all know about her and this guy and what's going on and like why she's in the town, and it's just, they were very nosy, like almost like Miss Patty in Gilmore Girls. It reminded me a lot, and like Babette when they're like gossiping together, it sort of reminded me of them in Gilmore Girls. And this is another really good romance book. Really love this one. Next is The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes, and you're probably like, okay, what does this have to do with Gilmore Girls? But like, hear me out for a second. So this book follows Avery, who randomly finds out that she's inheriting like $1 billion from this guy that she's never met. And his grandsons show up and tell her she has to come to this will reading because he's left everything to her. And she shows up and kind of gets stuck in this house, and they're trying to figure out why this grandfather has left things to this girl he didn't know. And the whole series sort of follows them trying to figure this out, basically why she was chosen. And I really enjoyed this one, but I think what really reminded me of Gilmore Girls was like two aspects of this. One was that the way Avery was like from nothing, like she didn't come from money or anything, and then all of a sudden was living in this world of like all these like really rich kids and things. That reminded me a lot of Rory when she starts going to Chilton, and all of a sudden she's with all these, you know, kids that have super rich families and parents and things, and like they all get cars for their birthdays and things. And this reminded me a lot of that aspect of like the broke girl ending up with all the rich kids, I guess. And that reminded me of that. But also Avery in this book has a friend named Max who reminded me so much of Rory and Lane's friendship, because Max's parents are very similar to Lane's parents. They're ultra religious, very strict. Like, she doesn't swear, she's very careful about everything, she doesn't go anywhere or do anything really, and she's kind of calling Avery all the time to see what's going on and like get the updates, and she's sort of sneakily doing all these things her parents don't know about. And it just really reminded me of the vibe between Rory and Lane, where Lane couldn't go out a lot and her mom was really strict and she wasn't allowed to date and like all these different things, and she was very big on like Bible study and all that stuff like this. The two characters are very similar in that aspect, and it just reminded me a lot of Rory and Lane. And so that's why I think this book would be good if you're a Gilmore Girls fan, because it does sort of have those same like underlying elements that Gilmore Girls has. Next is Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. The couple in this book reminded me so much of Luke and Lorelai. This one follows a girl who is kind of out there. She's always wearing these like really quirky outfits and just like, you know, doesn't care what people are thinking. Like, if she's at a concert, she's gonna be like wildly dancing and doesn't care who's watching her or if they're making fun of her or anything like that. Like, she just does whatever she wants and whatever she feels like doing in the moment. And the guy in this book is not really like that. He's kind of quiet, more reserved, and he is just so enamored with her though. And in this book, basically they're dating other people, and he's kind of always thinking like, okay, but I like her, and like I like all these things that these other guys don't like, and like why don't they see what I see in her and things. And it's like a best friends to lovers kind of evolution. And this is, like I said, so good. Really enjoyed this one, but reminded me so much of Lorelai and Luke, where Lorelai's kind of always doing really weird things, and like Luke may not get it, but he still is kind of like happy for her or like supports her when she's like, oh, I'm gonna like, you know, do something crazy. He's just like, okay, but like how are you gonna do it? And like, you know, like he's not like, oh, you can't do that right off the bat, and he just like kind of supports her like weirdness, I guess. And this couple really reminded me a lot of that. And again, with like the best friends to lovers sort of vibes, where like Luke and Lorelai obviously kind of dance around each other for a long time before they even remotely like test that out. And so I think that that was, you know, something that reminded me a lot of them in this book. Next was You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hogle. This one I feel like is another weird one that you're probably like, why did this remind you of Gilmore Girls? But basically this book follows a guy and a girl who are engaged, and they're gonna get married, and she sort of realizes she doesn't actually want to get married, and his parents are kind of planning the whole thing. Like, they've got all the flowers picked and all this stuff, and she's like, you know what, I don't really care. I don't even really think I want to be with him anymore. And he's sort of feeling the same way. He's like overwhelmed with this whole wedding and stuff, and they are kind of, you know, at odds with each other, but whoever backs out has to pay for the wedding. So they're kind of going at each other, trying to see who is going to break first and call off the wedding, because then they'll have to foot the bill. And what reminded me of Gilmore Girls in this one was the way that they sort of work against the parents. Reminded me a lot of Lorelai, and probably Lorelai and Christopher, I would say, against her parents, like when they were like sneaking around and like conspiring against them and like different things. Like, it just reminded me a lot of that like dynamic where the parents were kind of like in charge of everything, but the kids were just like, no, like we don't want to do this, we're going to do what we want. And that's sort of what brings them together, is their like mutual dislike of what the parents are doing. And that just reminded me a lot of Emily and Richard's relationship with Lorelai, as like this book, like his relationship with his parents, and reminded me a lot of that. And I think towards the end of the book you definitely see a lot of that, where you see the parents kind of in situations that are very similar to how I think Richard and Emily would have been with Lorelai, and I just couldn't stop making that comparison when I was reading this one. Next is Juniper Hill by Devney Perry. This is another one of my favorite books, and this one follows a woman who takes a job at an inn, and basically is like, I'll do anything, like I just want to move to this town, and you know, I want this job, but I can't find any place to live. Like, the real estate in this town is just like non-existent during this season that she wants to move there. And so the owner of the inn is like, okay, why don't I let you stay in my brother's guest house? Like, he doesn't care, he won't mind. And she's like, no, like I could never do that. And she's like, no, seriously, like it's not a problem. I really need you to come work, so like I'm willing to, you know, do this to get you here. So this woman's like, okay. She has a new baby, she comes, she shows up, and she moves into this guest house, and of course the brother, Knox, has no clue that this girl is showing up to live in his guest house and is just like, I never agreed to this, like, why is this woman here to live on my property, like, I don't like this at all. And this one sort of reminded me again, like with the inn and everything, reminded me of Lorelai, and even like I'm blanking on her name right now, but that older woman who took Lorelai in when she was pregnant, or right after she had Rory at the inn, this reminded me of that, where this girl was like, no, I need you to come to the inn, so like I'll do anything, like you can live on this other property and come work at the inn, sort of thing. That reminded me sort of a little bit of Lorelai's backstory. And just like the small town this is set in was very reminiscent of that. A lot of this takes place at the inn because he works there as a chef and she is working, I believe, as a housekeeper, I'm pretty sure. And so they're running into each other a lot, and there's just a lot of this was set in the inn, like I said, so it reminded me a lot of Lorelai and her inn. And I really love this one, like I said. Even if you're not a Gilmore Girls fan, this book is so good. I always recommend it. I absolutely love it. Next is Pumpkin Everything by Beth Labonte. This is obviously a little bit more of a fall read, but reminded me a lot of Stars Hollow in the fall, where everything is just overly decorated and they're doing all the cutesy like Halloween things. And she basically in this book is moving back to her, she's not really moving permanently, but she's going to help her grandfather in the small town that she grew up in because he has driven into a Dunkin' Donuts and broken his wrist, so he can't run his store, Pumpkin Everything, which sells pumpkin everything. And he can't run the store, he can't really, you know, do a lot of things around the house, so she comes back to this town to do that, but she has been avoiding this town for years because her ex lives there and she doesn't want to run into him. But of course she bumps into him within 5 seconds of being back into this town. And this one is really cute. It really, like I said, reminded me of the fall festivals they have in Gilmore Girls, and just like, I feel like Gilmore Girls in general has a very fall vibe to it, like just as it is, even when it's not a fall episode. And so this reminded me just a lot of that because it's got that like cozy fall feel to it, and I really enjoyed this one. It's actually a Hallmark movie now, if you wanted to watch it too. And so like I said, really enjoyed this one. Definitely like small town fall vibes with it. And lastly is When in Rome by Sarah Adams. This is a small town romance, which is again kind of what reminded me of Gilmore Girls. This one follows a famous pop star who is kind of like, I just need a break from everything, I'm gonna go to Rome, Kentucky. And so she shows up and she ends up, her car breaks down in this guy's front lawn. And he comes out and he's like, what are you doing? And she's like, my car broke down, but I'm not getting out of the car because you might murder me. And he's just like, okay, like you're a little nuts, but like whatever. And she ends up staying with him for a while. But this one, what really reminded me of Gilmore Girls is he basically says to her like, okay, you know, I can take you to the inn and get you a room, like we can go and see. And she's like, oh, it's fine, like I can, you know, pay for it and whatever, but like let's go, we'll see if they have any rooms available. And so they show up at this inn and the woman at the desk is like, nope, sorry, no rooms available here. And she can tell, like the main girl in the book that's the pop star, she can tell that this woman is lying and she's just saying it so that she has to keep staying with this guy. The whole town is kind of conspiring to get this guy to get a new girlfriend, and so when this girl shows up and is in his house, everyone's like, oh my gosh, he's finally got a girl. And then they find out what happened, and then they're like, okay, we gotta make this happen. And this again reminded me so much of Babette and Miss Patty, particularly Miss Patty, because she's like really just in there like making sure that they have to stay together for no other reason other than that she wants them together. And so it reminded me a lot of like the town gossip in Gilmore Girls and how that sort of plays out in that. And really enjoyed this one as well. It's a really good romance as well. And so that is everything for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below. I do new book videos every single week, and I will see you next time.